Hello and welcome to episode 107 of our SAP on Azure video podcast. Today is August 25th, and together with Robert and Goran, we're here to talk about anything related to SAP and Microsoft. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
So after some vacation time, we are finally all back together. Robert, Goran, and I are back from our vacations. Well, Goran actually wasn't on vacation for the last few weeks, so he covered very well for the three of us. But now we're really looking forward to continuing with our topics. And 2 weeks ago, we actually had Cameron on the show to talk about tips and tricks regarding running SAP on Oracle on Azure. And there was a lot of extremely valuable content, and we already got some very good feedback and requests to do some follow-ups. So another colleague who has done a lot of Oracle migrations and Oracle related work is Samit Mishra. He joins us today to talk about more best practices and actual migrations, experience with working with customers on migrating SAP on Oracle to Azure. But as always, before we hand over to him, let's quickly take a look at some of the news from this week. And I actually want to start with a new blog post by Harut. He also continues his topic on SAP Private Link service. So you might remember SAP Private Link is the service on the business technology platform that allows you to connect to Azure services without the need to open up firewall ports and stuff like that, but we can really have a direct connection. And what Harut outlines in this blog post is how you can use the SAP Private Link service in combination with the SAP Cloud Integration. So the SAP Cloud Integration service, CPI, what it was called some time ago, and also the SAP Fiori Launchpad. So the idea is that if you have either integration needs that you're using iFlows in the cloud integration, that you can now connect to Azure services without the need to open up any firewalls, or if you use the Launchpad service. So if you have an SAP Fiori user interface that wants to connect to other services, and he outlines this in these both scenarios. The problem is that at the moment, CPI or cloud integration and the Launchpad service do not support Private Link natively. So what you need to do is you need to use an app router as a proxy, basically. And in this blog post, he outlines how to do this, how you can set up cloud integration to do this, and then similar also for the Launchpad service, how you can use the app router to use then Private Link to connect to your Azure services. And obviously in this case, for example, for an SAP system running on Azure behind a load balancer, and then connecting this with Private Link. Good. The next thing that I want to highlight is with S/4HANA Cloud 2208. There were a lot of new announcements. What's new in this specific release? But one thing that I want to highlight is the Teams integration. So now out of the box with S/4HANA Cloud, you have the capability to share to Microsoft Teams. So basically, if you have an SAP Fiori screen here, there is a small ribbon here where you can say, I want to share this information with Teams. And you can then share the link to a Teams channel, to a chat, so that others can easily navigate to your S/4HANA Cloud system. There's also a video linked where you can really see this in action. And I'm obviously super excited because this is the first touch point where we see S/4HANA Cloud working very closely, natively with Teams. And I would say stay tuned. There are some new exciting things coming there as well. Speaking of Teams, especially in Germany, obviously, there's a lot of debate on data governance, data protection, and Microsoft released a statement on can you actually use Microsoft 365, Microsoft Teams in a compliant way? And obviously, Microsoft says yes, you can. There are some highlights why Microsoft thinks this is relevant, why Microsoft thinks you can actually use Microsoft 365 in the public sector, mainly in the public sector. I mean, obviously, a lot of companies in Germany are already using it, but this addresses mainly the public sector to really say, yeah, you actually can use Microsoft 365 and Teams. There's a longer document in German, but I think it's a good statement from Microsoft on this. So speaking of customers that are using Teams, we released a success story with SAP on how SAP is using now Teams internally. And just recently, like 15,000 accounts in the SAP labs in India were migrated in a single day to Teams, so to Teams phones. So basically now you don't have a physical phone anymore, but you're really using Teams. And I think this really shows this article actually looks back at how it all started. So in 2011, when SAP introduced Link. Robert, I think we were both still at SAP. Goran, actually, you were also at SAP in 2011, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So all three of us we witnessed this change to Link, I would say. But so it really outlines the history also, I would say, and now really talking about all the 150,000 users now using Teams worldwide. So I think that's a really nice showcase that just shows how important Teams is and how valuable the integration there can be. Then one last thing, so switching away from Teams is the Power Platform. In the last few weeks, I actually had some discussions with customers that were all focusing on how can I get Excel integrated with SAP? And obviously there we have with Power Automate, we have some nice functionalities. You can also obviously write add-ins. But what we also see is more and more that it doesn't have to be Teams. So you can also use the grid control now in Power Apps, which obviously provides you with some additional functionality to fairly easily navigate, read and update now information also from a Power App. And I thought that was really, really interesting because, I mean, Excel is everywhere, that's very clear, but still Excel has a certain use case. And with Power App, you can now also do a lot of similar functionalities that you have this grid control that you can easily navigate and scroll and in the end update the information directly also here from Power Apps. So I think that is definitely also something that is worth checking out. And then if you want to hear the latest and greatest information, we have Ignite coming up. So Ignite will be there on October, so a little earlier than usual, October 12th to 14th. It's again a virtual event. I think it is only virtual. I don't think
virtual, and there is also a possibility to be in person in Seattle.
Yeah, you're right.
So similar like a ticket. So digital will be free of cost, and I mean in person, yes, will be paid. So similar like the SAP ticket is kind of being organized this year as well.
Cool. Well, I'm actually really looking forward to this because you might expect some exciting news also from the SAP ecosystem, I would say. Cool. So with this, I think these were all the news from this week. And with this, actually, let's hand over to Sambit. Sambit, maybe you can quickly start to introduce yourself. What are you doing at Microsoft? And then I'm really looking forward to hearing more about SAP on Oracle, on Azure, obviously.
Thanks, Holger. Hello, everyone. My name is Sambit. I'm from the SAP engineering team. So I'm mostly looking after customer engagements, which includes customers running SAP on Oracle in Azure. I'll quickly share my screen.
And I think while you share your screen, what I still find really, really interesting is that there are so many customers, really big customers that are running SAP on Oracle. So I think Oracle is I mean, has been for years now, obviously, I think a very, very important piece of an SAP installation. So we see lots of customers there. And now, obviously, for these customers, there's the question, they also want to go into the cloud. And similar like what Cameron talked about 2 weeks ago, I think we have a fairly good offering for them on Azure.
Yeah, Olga, I think if we talk about non-HANA DB after SQL Server, we could see most prominent databases as Oracle database that is running on Azure, which is running SAP workload in Azure. So, so the idea here is that to have this follow-up session. So I think the one was done by Cameron last week, and we'll have similar sessions because like this is a very vast topic, so it's not possible to cover everything in one go. So what we'll do is we'll have this high-level overview of SAP and Oracle in Azure, and then we can delve into specific topics like a data guard, backup restore, HADR in the upcoming podcast.
Fantastic, and I think we already got some feedback from customers, and obviously this is now also the chance to ask your questions in the chat, in the feedback in the comments, so that, as you said, we can pick up these topics and create a part 2, part 3, part 4 on specific questions that the audience might have.
Sure. So moving on, the agenda for this podcast is basically we'll talk about some of the design considerations for running SAP and Oracle in Azure. I'll share some of the landscape templates for running SAP and Oracle. I'll share one of the storage template using Premium SST, Managed Disk. And finally, we will talk about different learnings from some of the customer implementations who are running SAP and Oracle in Azure. Moving on, design considerations for SAP and Oracle deployments in Azure. So the first thing first, so this is a very common question among customers. So what is supported, what isn't supported, whether we can run Oracle databases on SLES or RHEL. So those kind of questions, this slides basically address that. So talking about the different Oracle versions which are supported in Azure. So all major releases starting from 11.02, 02.04 till 19.50 plus are supported in Azure. If we talk about the operating system, we have Windows servers and Oracle Linux, OL 7 and 8, both are supported in Azure. We only support single instance. There is no native support for real application cluster RAC in Azure. It's always advisable to refer to this specific note 2039619 for any changes. Now, one question that many customer has is, can we run our Oracle database on a SLES or a RHEL? That's not supported. We have to run the Oracle database server on any of the supported operating system, which is Windows Server or Oracle Linux. And the other question that is also common is whether can we run our application server on SLES or RHEL. So again, like that will not be supported because you have your Oracle client software running on SAP application server, and you have to run that on a supported operating system like either Windows Server or Oracle Linux. Your central services, SAP central services, which is generally set up in a cluster for high availability, that can run on RHEL or SLES. Again, like there is a question that can we run that on Oracle Linux? No, we cannot run that on Oracle Linux. That's a non-supported solution. So because it has additional complexity, you have to look for a third-party solution like SIOS if you are running your SAP Central Services cluster using Oracle Linux.
Samit, a quick question. So if I'm now a customer that runs, let's say, SAP on Oracle on SLES, what would be our recommendation then? Would it then be probably to go to Oracle Linux?
Yes, we have to go to Oracle Linux Holger in Azure in the target setup.
We have some. I mean, I guess from Red Hat, it's much easier. So if I'm running already SAP on Azure, SAP on Oracle on-prem on Red Hat, I think the switch to Oracle Linux is fairly simple because I think they're much more similar. I guess. Yeah, exactly. I guess if I do the same from SLES, it's a little more complicated, but I would assume we already have some some best practices or recommendations on how to do that?
It will still be considered as a homogeneous migration. We can use backup restore, or we can use an online data guard application as well to migrate the data. But again, like these are the only two flavors which are supported at the moment in Azure. Yeah.
Great. Yeah.
Okay, moving on, SAP and Oracle assessment. So once we have made the decision to move our SAP workload to Azure, now the second step is basically to run the assessment. So when we say we run the assessment, we basically talks about sizing the target hardware, like the target platform. And for that, we need a lot of source information. Like first one is the EWA report. So EWA stands for Early Watch Alert Report. This is a SAP service report which is generated weekly in most of the SAP systems. So that report we will need for at least 6 weeks time. Oracle AWR report, again, this is an Oracle report which most of the Oracle DB and SAP basis guys will be familiar with. Then we look for the SAR reports, system activity reports, SAN reports. Then we also look for, like, for the last 6 months, if we have any issues in the running system, say, for example, if we have any performance issue or a bad job running for longer time. So that sort of analysis is we also try to do, because that way we will be able to identify the expensive SQL on in those dialog or a batch job, and try to fine tune that as a part of the migration process. And like don't rely on one report for hypothesis, because again, like we should not be relying on just one report. The more the merrier. And don't confuse between the logical reads, physical reads, and the cache hit ratio. So the full table scan does not touch the buffer cache. Oracle Exadata. Now, for Oracle Exadata is a very special case, and for that we have to refer to the Oracle experts for the cloud migration. I'll quickly show the AWR report again. Like in AWR report, we basically have to look for the IO profile, which has the information for the total IO. So the total request section is basically talks about the IO. The total MB is corresponds to throughput, and if we have a RSE instance in the source, then we will have those information by node in the AWR report. Then we have the SAR report. So the SAR, the two most important thing is the IO, the TPS, which is the transfer per second, and the throughput, which is the block read per second and block write per second. And for analyzing a SAR file, we can download. So there are a lot of utilities available in the public domain. We can download any one of that and do the analysis for the SAR file. Then finally, the SAN report. So basically, we can get it. In most cases, we can easily get it from the hardware vendor, and that's basically looks like this. You have the IOPS information arranged in a graphical manner. You can specify the timestamp and get that SAN report, and also the throughput. It's again a report, graphical report, which you can get from the SAN team.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, early watch report from SAP are not enough, so to say, because all this information we need also to do the sizing in Azure. So early watch report will be helpful to know, okay, how much they size on the on-premise, how is the CPU load, how is the memory consumption, what are the statements of the SAP or jobs typically that run more. But Oracle AW reports give you really detailed information about the storage, and that would help to size also properly the storage in Azure, right?
Yeah, not just that. You know, of course, we want to be sure that we have the same power as on premise, but also from other side, you know, in most cases on premise systems are oversized. Yeah, so there's also going in direction. Okay, do we really need such a huge power of CPU memory ratio? Because from this report, we'll maybe minimize the CPU's count, and also save money regarding licenses. So this is not just you know, IOPS and throughput. Is also okay what we really need to have on Azure, because assumption is always that on-premise systems are oversized. Yeah? And especially Oracle pricing is very sensitive for CPUs licenses. So why not to try to save some money there too? Yeah?
Okay. Yeah, moving on into some of the general considerations. The first one is licensing. Again, this is very important while we are selecting the target VM SKU for the Oracle database server. Again, there is a master licensing document available at oracle.com, which needs to be referred to because your virtual CPU/cores in Azure map to specific Oracle processor license, and that has to be taken into consideration while designing the SKU for the target VM. Secondly, select the availability zones within a specific zone, specific region with the least latency. So this is important because the latency between the application to database should be less than 0.7 milliseconds, ideally less than 0.3 milliseconds. That has to be taken into consideration while we deploy our SAP systems in a zonal setup. And for that, we have a scripts available, which basically deploys a VM in each of this availability zone and run an IPing. Thirdly, we don't recommend PPG by default. Again, like this is mostly due to the allocation failures that we encountered recently, and it is only recommended in special case if we see very high latency. For a zonal deployment, PPG with availability sets can be considered to distribute the application layer VM into different fault domains and update domain. And this is basically considered with respect to HA. If you want to have HA for the application layer, what we do is we create a PPG with the SAP Central Services VM as an anchor VM, and then deploy all of the additional application servers in an availability set, which is assigned to the PPG. Yeah.
Great.
Then moving on to the compute considerations. So again, like this is a very common question. What should be the VM SKU for the database in Azure? Can we downsize our SGA and all of that? So basically, for a very large database system, generally anything more than a 5 terabyte database size, we recommend to start with M192MS SKU for the database server. So if it it can be some people thinks it's oversized, but I think it's for considering the migration process as well. It's good to start with M192MS, which is a 4 terabyte RAM VM, and then we can downsize it post the migration if we don't require that much of memory. We can further downsize it, but it's a good starting point considering your very large database migration. Secondly, for the application servers, it's recommended to go for EDS v4 or EDS v5 and DDS v4 and DDS v5 series VM. So again, like we have two set of SKUs available for this VM series, one with a temporary storage and one without a temporary storage. It's highly recommended to go for the VM with temporary storage, because that way we can leverage the temporary storage for swap space and for the kernel dumps as well. And lastly, it's recommended to execute the performance diagnostics for Azure virtual machines. Again, like this is a good tool which you can use for some of the performance analysis. It's basically an extension which can be installed on the virtual machines, both Windows Server and Linux VM, and it's a good tool to run some of the different scenarios. So we have a general performance scenario, we have one detailed performance scenario. So those checks can be executed on the VM and we can get some reports out of it. Moving on to the storage design. So the second part of the compute is storage, and here if we start with the Windows servers, there is no support for Windows shares. Only locally attached storage is supported. It is recommended to go for storage pool for premium disk. Non-M series VM, it is highly recommended to go for Ultra SSD for the online redo logs. If you see this table, there is a table for premium storage configuration recommendations, and there are two columns here. One, if we are going for ASM, the automatic storage management, it's a storage management solution from Oracle. So it's recommended to have this disk group data recovery and archive for ASM. If it's non-ASM, then we can simply mount it and we need to have those file system like /Oracle is for binaries. We can have one disk. Caching should be none for SAP data. More than 2 disks, and the caching is read only. And it is highly recommended to stripe the SAP data volume, because if you are running SAP data across multiple disks, it is highly recommended to stripe it to achieve the optimal throughput. Then ORIG log, mirror log, the caching should be none, and or ARC, generally one disk should do, and caching should be none. For Oracle Linux automatic storage management, it is highly recommended, strongly recommended to go for ASM, and I think it was also enforced in the blog by Cameron that this recommendation is coming directly from Oracle for all the very large databases system. Anything more than 5 terabyte should go for ASM, because that simplifies the storage management, and it's very good for the performance as well. It improves the performance. So it's very strongly recommended to go for ASM for all migrated Oracle system into Azure. Direct NFS is supported for ANF deployment, and other file system like XFS and EST4 are also supported. Moving on to the storage design consideration part 2. Basically, it is recommended to go for premium disk P40 SKU, because anything higher we won't be able to use the caching. So it's recommended to go for premium for a P40 disk, which is 4096 TB, and to allocate 4095 TB out of that, so that we'll be able to use the caching on those disks. Then separate the redo system, temporary table spaces and undo table spaces into separate data disk. Set new pod deadline algorithm for the IO scheduling. Disable barriers for the disk with cache read only or none. For OS disk, it is recommended to go for read-write caching. For system temp and undo, it's recommended to go for none. For use the read-only caching for data disk, enable write accelerator for radio log disk, and the stripe size. So stripe size for data volume, we can have either 128K or 256K. For the log volume, it should be 64 KB. Quickly jumping on to ANF again, like there has been a lot talked about this I think in the blog written by Anbu and Momin. I think they also had the podcast as well, and they talked about how they implemented Oracle on ANF. So this basically talks about the high-level design considerations, but again, this topic requires a dedicated podcast. So the minimum Oracle database version should be 19.14.0 with SAP bundle patch of May 2022. Then the NFS version 3 and 4.1 both are supported. No support for NFS over ASM. Mix of data files on ASM and DNFS is not supported at all. FAR request for co-location. So if we want to have our ANF storage and the VM pin to a specific zone, we have to raise a request with the PG. The Oracle snapshot feature is in preview. It's available now. I think by the time of writing of this slide, it was not there, but it is GA now. Use ANF when snapshot, clone, and revert are required. Consider compute throughput while selecting the storage, and use ANF when block storage is not going to work. Again, like ANF is pretty useful when we have a very high IOPS and throughput requirement for the database server, which cannot be met using the premium disk.
Yeah, because we are using network actually throughput instead of direct throughput, which is defined virtual machine for storage. So we have much more power there, or much more space there from throughput perspective. Correct?
Yeah.
Great.
Some of the network considerations enable accelerated networking. Again, this is a default setup in Azure, but generally sometimes it gets neglected. So it's highly recommended to enable accelerated networking on all the VMs, including SAP application servers and database servers. Run some latency and bandwidth check using QPOF and NIPing, and listening network ports check using PSPing or Nmap. Some of the Oracle DB considerations. So if the file system is in use is ext4, we have to use the DB parameter file system IO options to set all. If you are using ASM, the partition used for ASM disk should be created with a 1 MB or a 2048 sector offset. If using ASM, the set disk group AU size should be greater than or equal to 4 MB for large databases. Then we should enable huge pages and disable transparent huge pages on the Oracle database. Now with that, we'll talk about some of the landscape templates for SAP and Oracle deployment. This is a very general template. It's used by most of the customer across the globe. So this is for a zonal deployment. So we have 3 zones within a region, for example, West Europe. So they have deployed the primary region as West Europe and the secondary as North Europe. And here we have the Oracle database primary setting in zone 1 and the standby in zone 3. And we have data guard set up between them. Some maximum availability setup with sync FM mode and data guard using fast start failover. And we have 2 observer node, one active one in the 3rd zone, which is zone 2, and the backup one in zone 3. And for the application layer, we have HA between the central services, and we have multiple application servers for redundancy at an SAP application layer. Okay, moving on to Oracle high availability and disaster recovery, high availability. So again, like there is a very common question, what sort of infrastructure components we require for Oracle HA. Again, you don't need anything. You just Oracle database does not Oracle database HA does not require a floating IP. We can use the fast start failover option for HA in Oracle that does not require an Azure load balancer or a floating IP. The TNS names.ora will be handling the client connection to the new primary or to the standby database. Then disaster recovery is mostly we go for a backup restore option.
Samit, a quick question also to the previous architecture slide. This is all documented on docs.microsoft.com, right? So there.
Yes, it's documented. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It was one working template I just used here without naming the customer, just the region and all of that. But it is documented in our docs.microsoft.com.
Okay.
Then I'll go to one storage template using premium SSDs. Again, like the SKU here is M192 IDMS, which can support up to 64 data disk. It has 4 TB RAM and 192 virtual CPU. Now, if you see this, I'm not using the mirror log because I have implemented ASM. So mirror log is not required, and I'll talk about this in the later slides. Then we have dedicated disk for the org log 1, 2, 3. So here there are 3 online video log files. Then we have the different SAP data disk, and they are striped with this stripe size of 256K. And the log can be striped with stripe size of 64K. And the other file system that's everyone is familiar with, the /Oracle, the binaries, the user SAP SMD, Oracle SID, Oracle Client, and Aura Flash as a flash recovery.
And this is, I mean, this is obviously an example. How big was the database at this customer? Because if I see 80 terabytes, is this?
It was 68 TB, Holger, but they had this headroom there, considering the growth and also.
Okay. But I think that's obviously also a common theme, right? With Oracle, we typically see bigger SAP installations. So
Yes.
yeah, so that's why they are. Maybe that's also just an explanation why this whole architecture is so important. I mean, if you just run a small sandbox system, or if you just run a 1 terabyte system, then you don't need to put so much thought in throughput and the architecture. But typically, when we look at customers running SAP on Oracle, these are fairly big customers. As you said, we had this one session where we talked about a customer migrating a 100 terabyte Oracle systems to Azure. And obviously that's where you really need to make sure that the performance, the latency, the HA, the DR is really all set. And that's why it's to some extent so complicated to really make sure that everything is set up correctly.
Yeah,
So,
and I think these all systems that we talk about, basically they are running for say 20 years, 30 years,
yes.
and they have fine-tuned that system. Like if we talk about parameters, the secondary indexes, the expensive SQL, they have fine-tuned that like anything. So it's equally important to design the target platform for a best performing, for a high performing system. And this is a common myth as well, Holger, that for a lift and shift migration, we don't have to think about designing the target platform, which is incorrect. I think in most cases we have to put in a lot of thought process. I think a design window of 2 months, 3 months is required for designing the target architecture, the target platform that your Oracle database will be running on. And that requires a lot of reading and a lot of research into all of these SAP notes and the Oracle documents and the Oracle support website. So it's not a typical lift and shift, but there is a lot of effort involved in migrating an Oracle workload.
And Samit, one question in that direction. So for example, this layout, what we have now on the screen. So if I understand correctly, this is not something which we will expect to have on premise, because probably this layout will be in different way. Yeah? All those stuff, Oracle user stuff, and so all this basic stuff is of course always the same. But this somehow organizing your Oracle database logs will be probably different on premise, because on premise you don't need to care about this classical, okay, how much throughput I have per disk, how much virtual machine throughput I have. So I think it's very dangerous to take assumption that layout what I have on premise, I will just lift and shift in cloud and everything will work. Okay. Good learning.
Yeah, and all of this feature, Robert, as well as the write accelerator feature and for the M series VM that we don't have in an on-premise setup.
Yeah, of course.
The caching, disk caching, and all of that.
Great.
Goran, you were saying something?
Yeah, I mean, this is a lot of knowledge just on this slide.
Exactly.
I mean, when you see exactly, it's like, as you mentioned, 2 months, and just to have an example, of course, it's just an example. It's a lot of knowledge, but definitely gives you an idea that this template, how they could try and what they should think about it, and direction where to go, right? And I guess you should have also templates for the other storages like NF, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, I don't have it in this slide, Goran, but we can have that as a follow-up, because ANF itself is an elephant and we have tackle it separately. And again, like I try to reinforce, like we need to have a detailed design for an Oracle migration in Azure. So I have seen customers, they don't even go for an LLD document because they think of it as a lift and shift a kind of migration, which is a very incorrect approach.
And what I like what you mentioned about the compute, one point is to do the migration, use the bigger VM. Simply have most CPU, RAM, and storage throughput, network throughput. And when you are done with the migration, downsize.
Yes.
Right. Similar approach can be done also on the storage as well, because depends on what kind of migration they do. But typically, if they do some kind of export import, when they do import, they're building the database. It's hammering. It's all about the time to finish on a time inside of some predefined downtime schedule, a window, right? So to give storage, have more storage, or maybe with more throughput, with more IOPS during the migration, definitely it's also advisable, and then they can resize it afterwards for the normal runtime, right? So this is the benefit also of the cloud, right? What I mean, they can use it and then just pay as you go, right? As per need.
Yes. Now the final section of this podcast is basically talking about the different learnings from customer implementation. And I'd like to give credit to Philip Tan, who has prepared this slide and is the go-to guy from our team for SAP and Oracle deployments. So I'd like to thank him for that. Then let's start with the first one. So if using Oracle on premium disk, it is strongly recommended to go with ASM. I think this has been talked about multiple times, I think by Cameron and by everyone else from Microsoft. This should not be something very optional because of a fear of changing from the on-premise non-ASM database to an ASM database in target. And it does not involve much of a regression testing from an SAP application perspective. So it is something that customers should consider. Like, it is very strongly recommended, and it is also being coming from the Oracle as well, that you should go for ASM. So while one of the advantages is that while we use ASM for striping, we can drop the mirror log, and that has been documented in this SAP note 888-626, and we can free up that bandwidth for other database operations. So that was shown in the earlier storage template as well, that the mirror log can be dropped. The second point is that when we are using ASM, we have to use it end to end. So we cannot have few disks with ASM and some with LVM. So it has to be end to end ASM. And so the advantages of having ASM disk groups is that ASM controls the data distribution and striping over the disk. And adding disk to the disk group is also simplified. We can simply just add new disk to the disk group on the fly. One of the downside is that we cannot monitor free space from the OS anymore, and we have to do it from the DB level. The third point around observer node. Again, this is a common question. How many observer node can we have? 1, 2, 3. So you can have up to 3 observer node. It is recommended to have your active observer node in the third zone and backup one in the standby data in the same zone as you're running your standby database server. Send and receive buffer size tuning. Again, this is most overlooked thing during Oracle migration, and it is highly recommended to look into the kernel parameters, especially the send and receive buffer size. I've given a sample which can be a starting point for most Oracle database server during the migration to Azure, but that needs fair bit of fine tuning from the DBA or from the basis resource. Peak utilization AWR report for proper sizing, especially including the month-end closing and the billing cycle. So generally what we see customer doing is they run an AWR snapshot for a longer period of time. That's not helpful actually, because that's going to average out your profile. Okay. So it's good to have. So generally we ask for a daily AWR report for 7 days, and including the peak inflation period, like a month and closing and a billing cycle run as well.
That's good. Great. So I think it's very wrong to take assumption that I'm doing homogeneous migration, so I don't have too much effort, because still I need to be very, very careful what I have on premise and how to configure that in Azure. So it's not just, okay, I have the same, as we mentioned, same disk layout and will work with same settings, with same configuration what I have on premise. So this is can be very dangerous assumption if I understand properly. Yeah, correct?
Yes, sir.
Very nice.
And the third point, which talks about huge page configuration. Again, this is a very important point, and if overlooked, it could result in a very underperforming system, underperforming database server with a lot of swaps happening, and a lot of high CPU happening when you're running batch jobs and all of that. So it's highly important to configure. It is strongly recommended to configure huge pages on an Oracle database server. It is recommended to have 80% of your entire VM memory set as huge pages. And there is a good blog on this, on how to do it in 7-step But again, I have seen customer who does the huge page configuration, but they don't do it completely. Like if it's a 7-step process, they do 3-step and don't do the rest 4-step. So it's highly important to complete the huge page configuration entirely, like following those 7 steps, and do that in full and not in half-baked thing. And SGA, the target SGA size, it is recommended to set it to 90% of the huge page size. Say for example, a customer running 1.6 TB of memory can set the huge page as 1.44 TB. Sorry, a customer running in M192S VM, which has a 4 TB of RAM, can have 1.6 TB as huge page and 1.44 TB as the SGA size. The last point on the data guard application, the fast sync mode is recommended, which helps to reduce the commit latency, sync no FM. It is similar to, if we compare it to the HANA, it is similar to the sync mem.
Great.
Yeah, which has a good performance influence.
Yeah,
You're not waiting that it's immediately stored on another side, right? But it's done afterwards.
Yes, it's highly recommended for a zonal deployment.
Yeah, true.
So that's it from my side.
Nice.
So I think it's very, very obvious that you've not done this only once, but you have done this multiple times, and it clearly shows that we have a lot of lessons learned. So when customers are now thinking about migrating their SAP on Oracle systems to Azure, that they don't start from scratch, but there is so much valuable lessons learned and best practice already out there, so that we can clearly, with the reference guidance that you have, with the considerations around compute and also licensing, for example, I thought that was also really interesting. So it's not only the technical aspects, it's also a lot of other things that we have learned in the meantime in the last few years, I would say. And it clearly shows that there's a lot of knowledge available. Cool. So thank you. I think that was really valuable. And I think, yeah, we started the discussion with Cameron. This was a great another overview. And I know that there is a lot of, actually, to be honest, it was a little surprising to me, but there was a lot of reaction, a lot of feedback on the SAP on Oracle topic on Azure. So I think it would be fantastic to have you back and then have some dedicated deep dive sessions on other topics. Exactly. Great. Then I think we can close this call again in the bigger round finally. So in the next few weeks we'll again all be there. So I think that's really great. I'm really looking forward to that. Thank you very much, Sambit, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you again on the podcast.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.